Sweet. All right, well, thanks everyone for coming, choosing this workshop. There are choices, so I'm always flattered when people choose me. Thank you. Um, I was asked to come here sort of in capacity of an author. You may have heard, I wrote a book, a novel here, and as I was thinking about what I was going to say, the challenge sort of arose as to how I can really use this as an opportunity to talk to you guys when the vast majority of you probably haven't read this, and that's fine. Most people haven't read my book. So I wanted to take an opportunity to sort of use the idea of fiction and the idea of storytelling to segue into the topic of Genesis and the topic of the way that Genesis might intersect with modernity and sort of this anthropology that we've been talking about throughout the day. And the way that it happened for me was actually through the genre of dystopian literature. Now, I'm sure everyone, particularly in our highly politicized climate, has heard of certain dystopian genres, right? Everyone likes to accuse their political enemies of creating Orwell's 1984, for instance. And while those tropes are definitely overrated, overdone, there's some level to which the dystopian genre is it's visceral. It's related to our lives. We always have this fear that we're going to descend into this dystopian nightmare based on the decisions of politicians or our own decisions. And for me, getting into this genre was sort of by accident, because I always kind of thought of dystopian as sort of like just kind of bad news. Like Andy was talking about yesterday, tragedy. It's just a bad thing that happened, and how we're going to deal with this bad thing, or rather, in terms of 1984, how we're going to suffer in it and then just be sad or die. And so I kind of wanted to explore it more than the surface level. So I went through this kind of phase of reading the great dystopian works of literature. I read in 1984, I read Brave New World, Fahrenheit 451. And the thing that I learned, the thing that really stuck out to me, is that the dystopian genre is actually really useful, not just for telling us where we could go wrong, but for telling us what sort of people we ought to be to prevent that. Like so if there's an anthropology that leads to the wrong sort of outcomes, these dystopian worlds, then we can sort of reverse engineer that, and we can come to a conclusion of what sorts of people we ought to be to prevent these negative aspects of a devolving society. And that was sort of revelatory to me as I thought about the genre. It's a much more hopeful genre than you'd probably initially think. And so I set out to write a dystopian novel. And what I noticed about all the dystopian novels is they all have a couple of themes, certain things that are present in the genre as a whole. And one of the themes in most dystopian books, or the ones that I've read at least, is that you look at some element of society, something, and you amplify it. You say, what's the absolute worst that this could become? And then you write about that world. So in 1984, we have this society where power is amplified. The state gets so much power that it's unchecked. In Brave New World, it's sort of this libertinism or this pleasure-seeking element of the human that gets amplified. And what happens when everyone is just after the pleasures of their bodies? And what I wanted to kind of focus on was what happens when our dependence on technology, on the thing that we are sort of toying with now, when that gets amplified to the extreme, to 1100%, which that's the big question that I think we should all be asking anyway. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to there are certain tropes in this world that you sort of can't avoid, right? So if you're talking about like a highly technological society, you might see something like The Matrix, which is famously a retelling of Plato's allegory of the cave. So this idea of a world where they're plugged into this technological system, and for some, right, this would be a very bad thing, but we're seeing even today people who are welcoming that. People are saying, yeah, I'd like to get plugged into a computer. And so using those tropes like the allegory of the cave, and I used the first 11 chapters of Genesis as my framework for writing the novel, and thinking about what does Genesis say about what we should be, about who we should be. And then what happens if we remove all that? What happens if it's gone? And the foundation of our anthropology is based on something else, based on technology. And so with all those things in mind, I set out to write in this book. And you can read it, you can not read it, but the segue is this idea of our anthropology from Genesis. What does the Bible say about who we are, especially in these early chapters of Genesis, because they're so important, because there's a lot of added baggage that comes with the fall that we don't necessarily have to deal with in the early chapters. And so what is it that God wants us to do, that God wants us to be? And then how has modernity, how has technology, how has the world around us today sort of stripped those foundations? And when we answer that question, we find some really good antidotes for some of the troubles and the trials that we're in, or we can find ourselves in today. So, for those who have Bibles, you're welcome to take them out, your phones, whatever. If not, I will be reading everything. Oh yeah, there's Bibles in the pews. Everyone's got a Bible, no excuse. So, let's see, where will we start? Oh, well, I guess I should just also sort of plug this. This is the book that I wrote about this book. So so sort of like so this is like the nonfiction version of this, and so this is sort of what I'll be talking about today. What we can learn from the first 3 or 4 chapters of Genesis. So when we think about what we should be, what we should be doing, how we should be acting as human beings, sort of this anthropology is the word we've been using. I wonder if people want to participate. If you think about the Bible, it's the Westminster Catechism has been brought up, right? What is the chief end of man? If you think about the Bible, the scriptures as a whole, you can come up with some pretty good ideas of how we ought to be living. But as we sort of shrink our scope, shrink our focus to say maybe just the book of Genesis. If you just read the book of Genesis, what would you think you should be doing? What should you be like as a person if you just had the book of Genesis? Does anyone have any thoughts, any ideas? Shepherding. Not killing. Sure. Yeah, I mean, sure. If you zoom in to Genesis, let's just say 1 through 4, and you said, okay, I'm going to base my whole life, I'm going to decide how I'm going to live based on these 4 chapters of Genesis, what would you think is sort of the thesis, the important things? Yeah, absolutely. That is definitely in there. Yeah, sure. hmm Good. So we've got creativity, we've got communion with God, we've got communion with others, we've got multiplication. All these things are definitely found in these chapters. And the nice thing about, like I alluded to earlier, about these chapters in particular, is it's pre-fall. The first, even in chapter 3, we don't even hear the word sin. We don't get that until chapter 4. And so what we can find in these chapters is what I like to call sort of like foundational human anthropology. It's the stuff that we have before we get all the other stuff. We don't have really many moral commands at all. It's submoral, it's pre-moral, it's before we have to worry about morality. We have these things that God's telling us to do and God's telling us to be, and those are sort of like the bare minimum, the rock bottom of what we should be doing. And a lot of people, myself included, would relate this to one verse in Genesis 1, verse 26. God said, "Let us make man in our image and after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish and the sea, and over the birds of the heaven, and over the livestock and the earth, and over creeping things that creep on the earth." This idea of image of God has been parsed in many different ways, and there are a lot of good ways. And frankly, most of the ways that you'll hear the image of God parsed out are true. There's just different elements of this big picture of what we can be related to the image of God. The way I like to say it is we do the things that God does, and we are the things that God is, insofar as that's possible for us. There are many things that God is that we can't be. There are many things that God does that we can't do. But where that Venn diagram overlaps, that's the way that we image God. There are other ways. But so what we can do is we can look at the things that God does and the things that God says and the things that God is in these first chapters of Genesis and come up with an idea of what we should be doing. And so I've narrowed it down to 3 things. And of course, as with any great work of literature, you can probably parse this in 1,000 different ways. So my 3 ways are just 3 specific ways of looking at this passage, but there are many more. So for me, it comes down to work, creativity, and community. And we're going to find these 3 things. God does them, right? And God also commands us to do them. God's words to us and about us in Genesis 1, 2, and 3 show us that those things are important. So the first thing that we can do is we can look at this idea of work. And work is in the Bible all over the place. It's in Genesis all over the place. And there are 3 words that are used for work. Or rather, they connote work. Some of them aren't exactly work. But you see that God works in Genesis chapter 2. God blessed the 7th day and made it holy because on it God rested from all the work that he had done. So we have God exampling working. And we also have God telling us to work when he puts us in the tree, in the garden. So the Lord took the man and he placed him in the garden to what? To tend it and to work it. Those verbs, they can come out different ways, but in the ESV it says to work it and keep it. And then also in chapter 3, we get another sort of side of the work coin. The word in Hebrew is isabon, and it's when God is speaking to the man and the woman in chapter 3, in pain you shall bring forth children. That's to the woman in verse 16. And in pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. That word is sometimes translated toil. It's that other side of work. It's work on the other side of the fall. It's where things aren't working out as well. But we know that mankind is meant to be working. So a lot of times when people think about heaven or the new heavens and the new earth, they're like, oh, it's going to be great. There's going to be no work. But it seems, if we're going to kind of take this mirror image of the way things were in the beginning to the way things will be in the eternal state, that we have been designed to work. We've been created to work. And that work is good. It's good for us and it's good for the world. Looking at the way that the structure of the garden here in chapter 2, we have this whole world We know what the world looks like because we're here, right? But then God sort of zooms in on this place. He gives us some geographical markers and rivers and stuff like that. And he says, in this small place, there's a garden. And God put the people in this garden to tend it and to keep it. Now, the implication, or a lot of people will think about the world, is that everything was perfect. You'll use the word perfect in the Garden of Eden and in this chapter. But the implication of this is that they were in a place that they were supposed to work, right? The garden needed cultivating. It wasn't like, this is paradise, I'm going to sit down and a tree is going to kind of grow over my head and an apple is going to fall down and I'm just going to eat the apple. Like, there is work, there's stuff to be done. Not only that, as we exit this smaller section, this Garden of Eden, there's an entire world to cultivate, to keep, to subdue. The word subdue is used. So think that there's a wilderness out there that is not touched by human hands, and that our touching it, our working it, our being involved in this world is making it better. I think today with your modern environmentalists we like to get this idea that humans are spoiling the world. We're making the world a worse place, and we need to have places sequestered from humanity so that we don't mess it up. But the way the Bible talks is that the world is actually better with us in it. If we're doing our job as workers, as cultivators, as keepers, we are actually making the world better. We need the world needs us. This symbiotic relationship between us and the world is clear in Genesis. So we know that God has asked us, has probably better, more than asked us, has commanded us, has created us to work. And work is one of those things that is foundational to our humanity. The other is creativity. I use this word separately from work on purpose. So my definition of creativity is taking materials and making them better than they were before. So taking something and improving it using these faculties of intellect and emotions and will, these human faculties, making them better. And you can extrapolate from these passages places where that's done. When God tells us to, in the dominion mandate here, Genesis 1:28, God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over the fish and the sea and the birds of heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." The face reading of that is, have a lot of kids. Done. But there's a deeper message there. It's not just have a bunch of kids, it's find the way to sustain the thing that you're doing. So you're going to have kids, your kids are going to need to eat. They're going to need a place to live. They're going to need many different things. And so by extension, this mandate is for us to make the world suitable, make it habitable for people. And as you do that, you're going to be doing creative work. It's not just toil, though toil does come in soon after that. But there's a creative element to our work, and the clear parallel is with God. God's created. He has created all the resources that we have, and we're working with those resources as we've heard the word co-creators. CJ used Roger Scruton's, that book was Culture Counts, is the name of the book. And Scruton says that we are recreators. So we're taking creation and we're recreating. We're creating something out of the creation, and we're making it better. Not that we're improving on God's creation, but we're taking those materials and we're using our faculties and we're making something that wasn't there before. And that obviously exalts who God is, right? God didn't just make a creation, but he made creators. He made people that would go ahead and create symphonies and pieces of art and buildings and other people. That's kind of cool. So creativity, and then finally the other one is community. this one was when I first sort of saw this nuance of this passage, it was very revelatory to me. But everyone has heard, I'm sure, this passage in Genesis 2, verse 18. God says, "It is not good that man should be alone. I will make him a helper fit for him." We've all heard this, right? The surface reading of this passage is that Adam is alone. That's not good. Here's Eve, right? But it's actually much broader than that, because it's not good for man to be alone. God gives him Eve. Yes, true. But what does that do? That creates all the other relationships that we have. This creates parent relationships, brother-sister relationships, cousin relationships. Finally, it expands to the point where we have strangers and enemies and bosses and friends and all of these relationships that come out of that. When God says it's not good for man to be alone, he means we exist in a community. It's not just two people. It's not just four people. It's the whole thing. It's everyone that becomes from this not good to be alone. And we know this because in chapter 1, God says, "Be fruitful and multiply." The point is we're making more people. And when we make more people, we create communities. And there's also some hints in there, because you'll notice, and maybe it kind of looks strange at first, but when God says it's not good for man to be alone in verse 18, you would expect the next verse to be verse 21. "So the Lord caused a deep sleep on him, and while he slept, he took one of his ribs." Okay, great, made Eve. But that's not what happens. We have a whole little excursus in there where God is talking about bringing animals to Adam and saying, "You can name these." And I think that's a really important section, because while it gets overlooked, it sort of solidifies all these relationships that we're talking about. It talks about work, right? It says, okay, Adam, you have a task to do. And your task is to name these creatures. But what does that mean? It means that you're going to be exercising that dominion, right? When you name something, you are putting yourself in relation to it as above, as something that is dominion, subduing, that sort of thing. But it also shows the communion and the community that God has with Adam. This is one of the few places that we see God coming in and interacting with the man in this place. The other one is actually in chapter 3, which hopefully we'll get to. But God comes in and he says, "Here, Adam, what do you want to name this one?" And Adam gives him a name, and he says, "Oh, how about this one?" So God is coming and he's communing, and that's the other element of community. It's not just us communing with each other, but it's us communing with God. So we have these elements of work, creativity, and community. And you can also probably put in rest. Rest is another good example of sort of like a side project of work, right? Because today, like, we have these two polar opposite views on work, right? We have people that say, let's do as little work as possible. Or we have the people who say, let's work, and make a lot of money and get nice cars and be successful. And really, there's this middle ground where I think the Bible really does hit the nail on the head here, where we work, but then we intentionally say, nope, I'm going to rest now. So I'm going to step away from the work, and I'm going to, back in the day, back in this time, well, maybe a little later, right? Sabbath was an expression of faith. It was saying, I am in a place where I need to work to live. I need to eat. I need to do all these really important human things, but I'm going to stop that. I'm going to trust in God, and I'm going to say, for this period of time, I'm going to rest. So, rest is not, God gives us the example of rest in chapter 2, but the sort of fullness of that idea isn't really brought out until later on in Exodus. So let's think about these things: work, community, and rest. And let's think about them in terms of modern society, in terms of our sort of technological society. I talked a little bit about work just now and the sort of attitudes towards work that are unhelpful. But what about community? Our community with each other. Surely that's something that's suffered in the last 20 years with social media and the internet. And it was Andy that was talking about Zooming communion. Um, we have these surrogates for community that we, in the moment, think replace community. We think that we're doing it. We're having a conversation with each other on Facebook Messenger or even a video conversation. Um, we're more social than ever. I can talk to whoever I want, anytime I want with my phone. But what we're finding in reality is that we're less communal, we're more lonely. And not only that, but the sorts of things that would normally consist of community are actually being avoided. People are now finding most of their romantic partners online. That's new. Stuff like knitting clubs, right? People, I'm not going to say old ladies, but people will get together and they'd knit together and they'd be in a circle and they'd chat about whatever, I don't know. But they'd be there, they'd be in person. And now those things are online. Everyone's knitting in their own living room and they're just video chatting with one another. So that's one of those paradoxes of our modern technological world, right? We think that we're being more social. We think that we're in more community, but in reality, we're in less community. And the same thing sort of, another fractal of that is in our communion with God, right? There are many ways in which we think we're doing it, but at the same time, I'm going back to Andy's thing with the communion on Zoom. There are certain elements of the cult of religion and the what we think we're doing isn't exactly hitting the nail on the head. We're not getting what we should be from these things. And then creativity. This is another really interesting one because with the amount of time that we've kind of bought for ourselves in modernity. There was once a time where you'd probably work when the sun was up, and then you'd go to sleep, and then you wake up and you do it again the next day. But we've purchased ourselves so much time, right? Where you have an 8-hour workday, weekends off, where we should be creative. We should be making things. We should be sort of reflecting God in the way that we interact with the world. We should be making beautiful things, especially as Christians. I mean, especially because as Christians, we need to even more so reflect God's creative attributes. But what do we find ourselves doing? We're not creating, we're consuming. We spend our time watching things on TV, Netflix or YouTube. We find ourselves playing video games. We find ourselves doing these things where we're just consuming. And the irony of this is, with all this time, we would be able to create so much. And with all the stuff out there, right? I think this was something else that CJ said. There's so much material out there, but a lot of it's not very good. In fact, a lot of the times we're looking for things to consume. I mean, there's it's almost like a trope out there where you spend more time looking for the show that you want to watch than you do actually watching a show, because we're just inundated with this material to consume. But the difference between creation and consumption is actually a huge difference, because on one hand, you are exercising some relationship to the thing. So when you create, you're getting your hands on it. We were just talking about woodworking. You're putting your hands on the wood. You're actually interacting when you're playing music. You're actually interacting with the thing. Whereas with consumption, you're not. You're not doing any of that. All you're doing is pleasing yourself. Another thing is that when you create something, ideally it should be going out into the world. So I've created this thing, and now say I've created a desk. We create a desk, someone comes to my house, oh, that's a nice desk. You can appreciate it. Someone else can look at it. Maybe I'll die. It'll be a really nice desk, and someone will inherit the desk. It'll be somewhere in the future, someone will have that desk. So we have a problem, right? In modernity, we have a problem where the things that we should be doing innately, right, we're not doing. And it's so funny because the Bible doesn't say, maybe I'm wrong, you can correct me, give me a chapter verse, that's fine. But the Bible doesn't say, thou shalt be creative, thou shalt work, thou shalt live in community. Because it's obvious, right? For 2,000 years, 6,000, how many thousand years, that was an obvious thing. No one needed to say that. Because in order to live, you needed to work, you needed to use your brain and create, and you needed to live in community with other people. There are always going to be exceptions, but for the most part, that's true. And what the Bible says, the anthropology of these first couple chapters of Genesis are now being called into question. Right? When we say, what should we be doing? When we ask that question, most of us aren't saying, oh, I should be working. I should be creative. I should be in community. We think more, the rest of this book, which maybe you shouldn't, right? I mean, I'm not saying that the rest of this book doesn't contain these truths, but the foundations are here, and we're saying, okay, what should I do now? I shouldn't lie. I should do some moralistic stuff. I should go to church. I should pray. All these things, obviously very important. But when the foundation of what God is saying we are communal creatures, we are creative creatures, we are creatures that work. When that erodes, then we're left with big problems. And the beautiful thing is, for us, once we realize this problem, it's very easy to fix. This is something that anyone can do. It's about our attitudes towards these things, right? We can work a healthy amount, right? Knowing that we can overwork, knowing that we can underwork. Think about this. It's like within the last 100 years, you can work. You can decide, I'm not going to work, period. I will not do it. And you'll still live. You'll be fine. Someone will pay for you or something. You know what I mean? Like the government will take care of you. You can do that, right? You could also, on the other side of things, say, I'm going to work every day. I'm going to get myself a Bugatti. That's my thing. I'm going to get a Bugatti. And you can do that too. But the Bible is very careful to put us in this middle path where we are created to work, we're meant to work, and we're also meant to not work. We're meant to rest. We're meant to put time into spiritual matters, time into other things. Now, what time is it? Okay, we got time. All right. So the cool thing about this that I've really, when I think about these three chapters, I sort of think of that as like a sort of a hard line of demarcation between chapter 3 and chapter 4. And then there's another hard line there at chapter 11 before Abraham. But like 3 and 4, there's kind of like, we're in a different world now, right? The world the Adam and Eve sinned, and now we're in the post-sin world. But what I realized, if you take sort of like a literary approach to this book, chapter 4 is sort of like, I call it a case study. Chapter 4 is what happens when we don't regard 1 through 3. And you'll find that obviously the reason that the fall happened in general is because people didn't heed God. They didn't do the things that God said to do, particularly abstain from eating the fruit. But there was a lack in community, right? There was a lack. Adam and Eve didn't do the thing that they were supposed to do. God created this relationship, and that relationship faltered, and that relationship led to the fall. The same thing could be said about the work. Adam and Eve were meant to subdue and rule over this space, but rather a creature came in, who they were supposed to be subduing and ruling, and came in and subdued and ruled them. So when these things don't go well, we see what happens in chapter 3, but we really see what happens in chapter 4. And chapter 4, I really, the more I read it, the more I appreciate it. Chapter 4 is bookmarked by two births. We have the birth of Cain, and then at the end of chapter 4, we have the birth of Enoch. Not Enoch, Seth. And those two births are sort of approached very differently. In the beginning of chapter 4, note also that Adam's done. He's done. He doesn't have any more speaking roles. He's out of the picture. All he does is what's required for making babies, and that's his job from here on out. But Eve does have some speaking roles. And when Eve conceives Cain, she says, "I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord." And a lot of people will read this and they'll say, "That's very nice. Eve is being very humble. She's saying God helped her." But I think a more appropriate reading of this is actually more of a boast. Eve is saying, "I did this. Look at this thing that I created," especially in light of chapter 3, where God says, "You're going to have a seed, and that seed is going to rescue you." So she's like, "Here it is. We did it. All right, all done." This happens a couple times in Genesis. Lamech says this. He says, "All right, this is the one that's going to give us rest." So a reason that a lot of people believe this is because in the Hebrew, a lot of these words aren't there, particularly with the help of. That word is supplied by the translators. The Hebrew says, "I have gotten a man with the Lord." So a lot of people read this as, I like God, God created, and now here I am, I'm creating. Great, I'm great, and this is great. That's kind of how I read it. I read it as a boast, right? And so what you have the remaining parts of this chapter, we have time and time again people not living up to the thing that they're supposed to be doing, not living up to their responsibilities as a community, not living up to their responsibilities with work. I mean, think about Cain. He's the first workaholic. He's the first person that put his work over other important things like community. Cain, he had a sacrifice, and Abel had a sacrifice, and the Lord regarded Abel's sacrifice. And, there's arguments as to why and everything like that, and whether or not it's a blood sacrifice. None of that really matters for our purposes, because what we know is that Cain was upset about this. And when and the reason he's upset about it is because of pride. The same reason that Eve got a man-child with the Lord. I did it. I have done it. This is the work of my hands. This is my creation. And you don't accept it, God. What's wrong with you? And then, of course, the element of jealousy. This community, this relationship where Cain and Abel were supposed to be like this. They were supposed to be in community. They were supposed to be building one another up. They were supposed to be pushing each other on toward faithfulness. And what are they doing? No, they're not doing that. They are fighting. Well, I don't even know if you could really say it's fighting. One is killing the other. And so when these relationships go wrong, sin is involved. Like I said, sin is first mentioned in chapter 4. We can't discount that. But it's also this dissonance. God has set up this picture of what we should be doing. And then showing us through the narrative of chapters 3 and chapters 4, that when we don't do it, when we don't take these things seriously, when we don't work like we should, when we don't create and when we don't commune with one another as we should, things go wrong. And so we know Cain kills his brother, and then things just kind of go crazy. We've got a guy killing a bunch of people, and he made a poem about it. That's in chapter verses 20 and on. And then we have this other bookend where Eve has another child. She has Seth. I think she sees all this kind of crazy stuff that's going on. She sees her son being killed. She sees all these people proliferating in the world and fighting and killing each other and boasting about it. And she says, God has appointed for me. Look, the subject of this is now God. It's not me. It's not I have had a man-child. It's God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him. And then what happens? Seth was born, and he called his name Enosh. And at that time, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. So once people realize sort of the dynamics and the relationships that they should be living into, once that the pride of creation subsides and people realize like God is indeed the creator, God is the one who made these things, God is the one who appointed these things. When that humility sets in, and I think that humility comes in relation to God, and it comes in relation to all the other objectives that we have as humans. Then we're able to call upon the name of the Lord. And so, for me, I think we need to look at those foundational human elements. There are others, right? I just picked three. But we need to look at those and we need to see, are those things in check? Because I think even if, you're doing a good job at all the moral stuff, you're not killing anybody, you're not lying, you're being, as far as that goes, as good as you can, right? If these things are out of whack, we see it all over the place. The sad reality is like how many pastors' kids are just super messed up because the pastor is working ministry, and not spending time in community, not doing the responsibilities that they have for their kids. The same would go for anybody, right? There's many ways that we can fail to live up to this foundational core human responsibility. And the reality is it's easier now than ever. It's easier to have a bad relationship with work than ever. It's easier to consume rather than create. It's easier to live outside of community than it ever was. And I just think that's something we really need to look at carefully and think about the implications of these elements of our humanity, more than we ever have. So that's this book in a nutshell. Okay, so and yeah, does anyone have any thoughts, any questions? Yeah.
Very direct personal question. What do you do to be a sub-creator? What do you do in your meantime?
Well, I write. Yeah. So there's a couple things that I think that everyone has the opportunity to do this. My definition of creativity is a bit broad. It's taking materials and making them better than they were. So like my view of creativity extends to a lot of things that might be more like organizational. So like I think about homemaking. Like that's a great opportunity for you to create a space in which your family can thrive, right? So making sure that like that we have nice meals or dishes are done and everything's organized and your family can thrive within the space that you have. Like that'd be one example. Your personal style, look, I'm very stylish. The way that you groom yourself, all these things are opportunities to take these materials and make them better. If you can, like this is, my pursuit is to have a job where the work and the creativity coincide. Right now, I run a lawn care business. There are limited opportunities to do this, right? Trimming bushes or making sure everything's nice and neat when you're mowing lawns. Yeah, exactly. So there are, but I think that that it's a mindset. If you're looking for it in your life, I think you'll find it. But then there's also the extra time. We're not always working, so get a hobby. Pick up art. Pick up cinema. I don't know. make a movie. Yeah,
Community then, from what I'm seeing, and I'm just trying to extrapolate, should probably begin at home.
absolutely.
So, I mean, in today's world where phones are, we talk about going out to a diner. And if you walk into a diner and sit down and look around you, you have all families together, each table. And I can pretty much bet that 75 to 80% of them are on their phone.
Hmm.
They are not communicating. But now let's take that to the next step then, as far as your extended family. People have now the ability to be so far apart that in the days we're talking about there, I'm betting the family lived and died within probably a stone's throw of themselves forever.
Yeah.
I would assume there's a much more, we should focus more, I guess, then on being able to keep that communication that way so that they will learn foundationally that, to extend that out into the world. So they don't even have personal, what I'm trying to say is family doesn't even have that first step of
Yeah.
community.
I mean,
So maybe it's deteriorating even the external stuff.
yeah, that's also a symptom of kind of the modern world that we live in, where people will take a job, half the world away because work is very important. I have to find that job. I have to find the right job that fits the degree that I got or whatever. And so, yeah, it's a clear priority shift where,
Being realistic, I'm saying using your foundational thing that as individuals, our first thought should be our immediate family. Because if we don't have that first step, then I can't see that we're going to be able to expand out there into people that we're not even related to.
yeah, I mean, when God wants to show us how things go wrong, He starts by showing us the most extreme version of it, right? This relationship that should be great.
See how the world is so messed up because people can't sit in a diner and talk to each other. See where they're not going any further.
Yeah, absolutely. Mm. Yeah, it's definitely a challenge and it definitely takes intentionality. I think there's sort of the trope of like the loner artist, right? That's always kind of been there. But I think that it's a broader idea of creativity where we're just sort of improving the world that we're in happens in these little spaces as well. I think of like homeschool communities, like or something like that where people are getting together to assist each other in education. um, but to your more direct point, I think that a lot of it is sort of hard to foster in the world, and perhaps you know perhaps based on where you are geographically, if you were maybe in a city or something, you'd be able to find 5 or 10 people that are into icon making or whatever it might be. But otherwise, yeah, it's too diffused to really do anything about. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because that was something I briefly mentioned. I think that what I mean, there's a lot of senses in which the church age or like the instantiation of God's people in post Jesus, um, recapitulates a lot of things that happened in the Old Testament. Depending on your positions on a lot of things, covenant sort of situation, but the church itself gives work a new meaning, right? I mean, I think at very least ministering to the poor, ministering to those who are in need, the orphans and the widows, evangelism, the Great Commission, all those things are work. And I would say ironically, but it's not ironically, it's very pointed. These things all happen in the context of other people, relationships. It's not, the church work isn't necessarily um, erecting buildings or planting plants or doing those things are all important, but it is in the context of other people that we do the work of the church. And I think that the cool thing is it also brings in this creative element of what is the best way to do that? Or today, we use different artistic mediums to do that. And so there's a lot of freedom in there to do that Great Commission work in a way that sort of sort of manifests the fullness of these ideas that are just in their infancy in this chapter. Yeah, I think that's something especially evangelicals are not good at. There's what's that guy's name? Fujimura. Who knows what's his name? You must know. Yeah, his first name had anyway, guy named Fujimura. He's a Japanese artist, and he writes extensively on this idea of Christians using art to not in like like this like 1990s like let's make a play about Jesus and we'll show the guy will be up there and it'll be so sad. But no, but like really using art, like he uses pottery and just making beautiful things and incorporating that into the way that we do church. Having beautiful spaces around us to worship, or communing through creating, and sort of the way that we see the world differs when we're creators. We're no longer consumers. We're no longer in it for us, but we're in it for what we can sort of manifest into the world in light of the truths that we know, and hopefully even more so carrying those truths, even if it's in a medium or a way that feels uh, less communicative. You know. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
as creation, and we should reflect that as co-creators with God. And I don't know how to recapture. I don't know how to get more people to recapture it, because it seems like most of the Christians I work with, that just doesn't ever. That's nothing that has ever entered their mind or their hearts.
Yeah, I mean, we're very pragmatic,
Yeah.
functional, and yeah, I don't have an answer for you.
What, just personally, from experience and being a leader of a church, seeing churches now and the things we've done, if anything, I would say that, and this is for Calvinism and in general, we have taken community out of church in so many ways. I mean, let's put it this way, in the front of a church, I mean, there's a QR code in front. Your phone, click, and even your tithes now. Oh, do it online.
Venmo or yeah.
I mean, we can say the idea of a basket passing and someone putting their money into it or something, but it's a different feel than, oh, I get a direct drawdown.
Sure.
In fact, you don't have to be there. You watch church online, well, give online, and just like you were saying, I think, once again, you're basically a consumer.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there is, well, I can be personal with you. We walked into a church one day, and every person in the church, when they saw us, smiled and shook our hands and said hello and welcomed us, and we knew that's where we belong. And just take from that, walking in the church, and you can go for a year and no one even says hello.
Yeah.
So I think we've lost that. Same thing with the phone. I'm doing a QR code instead of making
More pragmatic.
It is. It's just, it facilitates, but I think the church has become part, and I think that's what you're saying. We've taken this modernization or these technologies, and the church has not only accepted them, but has facilitated this separation.
Yeah.
To a degree.
Or at least not fought against it. That's for sure. Because has to be intentional, definitely. So yeah.
More of a comment than a question, but I actually wonder if perhaps some of to tie it in with like the theme of this weekend's conference, if some of the technologies that produced a lot of some of the greatest Christian beauty in the past handful of centuries is lost to us because we've replaced it with unbeautiful technologies. Cathedrals that literally took 6 centuries to build. Beauty doesn't come quickly, and it takes generations. And I don't think that we even have the concept of thinking generationally about
Oh
building
yeah,
beauty
for sure.
into our culture. Because as Tom was saying earlier today and last night, if you disconnect from the proper vision of creation, you're gonna, like, everything else goes mad and goes bad. And how do you plug that proper vision of creation back in
Yeah.
that quickly? You can't. So it's like back when there was guilds to learn how to be a papersmith.
Yeah.
When there was guilds to learn how to be a world-renowned marble carver. Like, everybody wants YouTube University and they want to learn how to craft something in 15 minutes when other people took 50 or more years
Yeah.
of their life just breaking their fingers trying to do their stuff right. And we want to be able to do it now and sell it on Etsy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, along with that, I just wanted to make 2 observations. I think it's amazing that when God creates, right, he says, let there be, and then there is. But then when he creates male and female, he says, let us. So even in the creation of people, there's relationship in the Trinity. And then I think what you said is so amazing that, right, we believe God could have created in 1 second everything. But what did he do? He took 6 days. There was time that elapsed, and I think even that creation ordinance is instructive to us, right? That there was both community and work.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, the Bible says work, right? In chapter 2, it says God rested from the work that he did. So, Yeah, so thanks so much. Oh.